debate. The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am standing once again in this House to talk about the imperative for federal action to deal with abandoned vessels because of fishermen falling out, being forced out of the commercial fishing fleet, because fiberglass is reaching the end of its lifetime, because climate change is creating different types of storms. All coasts of Canada are littered with abandoned vessels, and for 15 years it's been clear that there is a jurisdictional hole which no government has been able to fill, and as a result it's fallen to coastal communities who have had to try to jerry-rig a solution. My predecessor, Jean Crowder, as the member for Nanaimo Cowichan, had legislation in this House that was supported by who is now the government, by the Liberal Party, when they were the third party. And so we had real optimism that in this Parliament, this session of Parliament, we would find legislated solutions for abandoned vessels. I think back to my start when I was first elected chair of Islands Trust Council, which is a regional government in the Salish Sea, charged with a mandate of preservation and protection. We were approached by ratepayers on Parker Island, just off Galliano Island in the Salish Sea. They had been trying for 10 years to get a government department to say, yes, we will help you with this wrecked barge from the early 80s that had been sitting on their shore for 10 years. And every department gave them the runaround. They said, oh, talk to navigation, talk to environment, talk to land management, talk to the Coast Guard. And they were at the end of their ropes. So on behalf of Islands Trust Council, I went to the Association of Vancouver Island Coastal Communities Conference, and there were 5 other resolutions, not just from Islands Trust Council, but local governments from all over British Columbia, the Sunshine Coast and Vancouver Island area, all were facing the very same problem, and we were all at the end of our ropes. So we were able to bring together solutions to say, let's get together and design what would be a good fit. We looked to the Washington State, which has had a very successful abandoned vessel program operating since the early part of this century, lots of working experience. And we passed resolutions, AVICC did, then the Union of BC Municipalities. It became a big election issue in my riding, because when you've got a huge 100-foot hulking boat that in fact the federal government towed into your harbour, you know you want to vote on this basis. You're looking for an MP that will take the imperative to act to Ottawa. And so I was so honored to be elected to do this work. And I built into the legislation that I tabled in this House, I built on Jean Crowder's bill, and then I updated a year and a bit later, including because my amazing staff team found a way to build all the solutions from coastal communities into private members' bill. So that was April 2017, and I was right on the verge of bringing all those solutions into the House to debate it in December when, as you'll remember, Madam Speaker, the Liberals used some unused tactics to block and then basically vote down my bill to prevent it from even being debated and voted on. It was not a possible outcome I could ever have imagined. Because the Transport Minister said he was going to legislate abandoned vessels, I really hoped that he would just plagiarize my bill and bring my elements into his, or at least he would recognize when he did table his own bill on Halloween last year that he would see that the C-64 remedy of penalizing and fining abandonment of vessels wouldn't work unless you brought the elements of my bill, which would deal with the backlog but would also fix vessel registration, which would make it then possible to if you find an abandoned vessel, you need to be able to know who the owner is in order to send them a fine or a penalty. So, and this has been said in this House before, the 2 pieces of legislation would have worked well together. Yeah. The pieces that I had proposed, you would have heard, you could probably recite them along with me. Deal with the backlog by putting in place a pilot program, a vessel turn-in program, as has been done to great success in Washington and Oregon. Kind of a boat amnesty. People that don't know how to deal with the boat at the end of their life, they can deal with, they can get it out of the water where it can be safely recycled. Create incentives for fiberglass recycling and piggybacking on the government's avowed innovation agenda, let's do something to help us deal with marine plastics and waste fiberglass. Let's find new markets so we can recycle and work with local salvage companies to deal with this mess that we've never had to, it's a worn-out product we've never had to deal with before. Fixing vessel registration so you can make the boat owners accountable and not have the costs all end up on the backs of taxpayers, and more. All those solutions from coastal communities and coastal governments I had in my legislation. Then when that got killed by the government, then I worked very hard at the Transport Committee to insert each of those solutions into the Transport Minister's Bill C-64. And to my great disappointment, despite the fact that we had so many witnesses that said we want to bring all those elements in, people on the ground, the Chamber of Shipping, the West Coast Environmental Law Association, local governments, marina operators, everybody endorsed the pieces of the solutions of coastal communities that I was proposing to amend, and the Liberals and Conservatives voted all those amendments down, every single one. And so here I stand with my final attempt to improve this legislation and to bring the solutions that would actually help coastal communities into the bill. We identified during the committee study that in fact, the government is not going to apply this fine and penalty system in C-64 to government-owned property. And we have a lot of examples on the BC coast and the Atlantic coast of government assets becoming abandoned vessels. In my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Courtenay Alberni, he was very involved with removing the vessel Laurier from Bain Sound, which is a very rich aquaculture shellfish area. A lot of jobs dependent on that. When the Laurier sank, everybody was very worried. It turns out this was an old fisheries inspection vessel and had, chapters of many stories. I think it was also a Coast Guard vessel, a government asset that became an abandoned vessel. On the East Coast, the Cormorant is an old Navy ship that has been languishing at the dock in Bridgeport for over 10 years. Again, a government vessel that became abandoned. And famously in BC, a lot of my British Columbia colleagues will have seen there's an old wrecked BC Ferries vessel still with the logo on the side, and it is a disaster. I mean, it looks like a ghost ship. And we've got Coast Guard vessels, Navy vessels, a whole gamut. And so this amendment that I have before the House is to close that loophole, make the fines and penalties equivalent, whether it's a government asset, whether it's a private vessel, to be able to bring that accountability and fairness as well. And so I urge members all sides of the House, from a fairness perspective, from an environmental perspective, this is our last chance to try to attempt to improve and fix the Transport Minister's bill, which we do take pride in the fact that this is legislation that's going to be voted on in the final days of this Parliament. It's because of the tenacity and the pressure of the Nanaimo Port Authority, the Mayor of Ladysmith, John Elliott, the Seminas First Nation Chief. There have been a lot of cooperation that have led to some successes and have really got this on center stage. And so I've been pleased to see the pan-partisan support for solutions on abandoned vessels. I, of course, remain discouraged that some of the solutions that have been proposed by coastal communities that would have dealt with the backlog, that would have worked with salvage companies to create jobs and innovate and recycle, none of those elements have any presence in the Transport Minister's bill. And so there still is a lot of work for us to do as a country to get this problem off the backs of coastal communities. And voting yes to my report stage amendment to remove the clause that exempts the government from the same penalties that it's putting on private boaters would be the one thing we can do in these final hours of this Parliament. So for the sake of coastal communities, for small businesses, for tourism, for the coastal environment, I urge my colleagues to vote yes. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, to have worked full out over the past 3 years to make sure that all shipwrecks Canada-wide be managed in a far more respectful way, respectful for the environment and for Canadians, and that the government bring in measures, really serious measures, to make sure we have the resources so that we can work at recycling materials and that we can identify shipwrecks and manage all these shipwrecks on Canada's coasts. And the bill has to be effective, not just fine words. But there still is work to be done, and her amendment would make Section 5, would have Section 5 withdrawn, so that the bill can really target its objectives, which is to manage shipwrecks. The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to my colleague who has been fighting to have the Catherine Spirit removed from her drinking water lake in her riding since the previous Parliament. It's now 6 years at least, I think. 7 years, my goodness. We are tenacious. New Democrats are tenacious on this subject. We have, at the Transport Committee, we heard testimony that making government vessels subject to the same legislation that is meant to deal with private abandoned vessels would be really important. In fact, the manager of the Washington State Program for Abandoned Vessels, he said, we do deal with larger vessels ourselves in Washington State. Just a couple of years ago, we removed a 170-foot previous military tug. He said, we've actually done a couple of old Canadian Coast Guard vessels purchased by someone in Washington State several years ago, end quote. So one of the amendments that we proposed in committee that was voted down was to have the government take some responsibility when it's selling off a government asset to make sure that the person purchasing it has the means to look after the vessel until the end of its life. That was also voted down by the Conservatives and Liberals at committee, although we had strong witness testimony saying that we should take that route. So this is our last opportunity to agree with my amendment to close the loophole that would make government vessels also subject to Bill C-64 to deal with abandoned vessels.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Salaberry-sur.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm pleased to rise again to say that my colleague demanded that the bill require of the Minister of Transport to intervene and assume responsibility for these shipwrecks, as there are thousands of shipwrecks and abandoned ships throughout Canada. It's a real risk in terms of pollution for coastal communities. So the minister should be obliged to intervene, and it is not now the case in Bill 664. Can my colleague please comment?
Smith has just a little over a minute to respond.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The basic structure of my predecessor, Jean Crowder, former MP, her legislation asked that the Coast Guard be named the receiver of wrecks. That was supported by the Liberals when they were the third party in the previous Parliament. They voted down that amendment that I moved with both my legislation and then also the amendment at committee. We do hear from the Transport Minister that he considers Coast Guard now to be the de facto lead, and so it isn't necessary to change in legislation. However, we're not sure that that same interpretation might be taken up by a future government in this House, and so we still, with regret, are sorry that in legislation the Coast Guard has not been named the receiver of wrecks. We know that the good men and women of the Coast Guard on the water are doing yeoman's work to fill this gap, and under their own steam are taking a great deal of responsibility. We want to see them resourced and have that reflected in legislation.